Hi, Abraham. My question is, where do thoughts come from? I'm curious of it because is it really the choosing of our thoughts, or is it really the choosing of what we give our attention to? I think in the past of some of my experience, say in business, and things that have come up, a thought, where did it come from? I didn't sit and consciously say, I want this thought to come in.
Good.
Because somehow I feel that if I understand
Yes.
that produces happiness.
Good. Or sadness.
Something, or sadness. I'm looking for happiness.
Good, yes. We can explain this to you in a way that you will really hear it. Let's start with the word communication. So here, we are projecting knowing. Rather than calling it thought, we will call it knowing. In other words, let's say that you are standing out in this beautiful day, and you know this day. And by that we mean you can smell it, you can see it, you can feel it. In other words, there's an ambiance about it. It's a combination of the temperature in the air and the subtle sound of the birds or the traffic or the waterfall. It's the color and the fragrance of the trees and flowers and bushes. It's the texture of the buildings and the vehicles. And in other words, your knowing of this day, it would be hard to define it in little pieces, isn't it? Because it's a knowing. In other words, it's sort of something that you're taking in. Now let's try to communicate that knowing to someone. Well, you might communicate it with words or sentences. So you would begin saying, sky is blue, which someone would then have to associate with having learned that experience of knowing with that word of blue. In other words, the words are a form of trying to communicate knowing. Well, thoughts, in a sense, are the same thing. That's another way of communicating knowing. We talked yesterday about how a decision is a focusing of energy. Well, a thought is a focusing of energy. We'll take this a little further. You're going to hear this. Sometimes, as we talk about deliberate creation, people will say, well, what about the children? How would a little child negatively attract something? And we say, don't misunderstand. You're assuming because the child hasn't learned language, that the child hasn't learned thought, or that the child isn't projecting perception. So what we're really talking about here in all of this is right where we began yesterday. We're talking about vibrations. We're talking about energy. That's why we're offering lots of blocks of thought to Esther, who is choosing lots of words to try to convey our knowing, that says to you, you are all vibrational beings, and you are operating, you are sending signals to the universe that are feelings or knowings. You could call them thoughts. So let's start at the most subtle end of this and say that in your physical words, and not spending a lot of time trying to figure out what's the best way of putting it, that the most subtle of these vibrations, for the sake of this analogy, let's call the most subtle of those vibrations knowing. Sort of vague. A little less subtle, a little more specific, we would call the vibration feeling. A little less subtle, a little more specific, we would call the vibration thought, or belief, or desire. Thought. And a little less subtle, a little more specific, we would call the vibration word. Get the sense of it? In other words, it's all about vibration. Now, where does the thought come from? A woman recently who lives in this area, or not so far from here, gave us a very good story that will help us to convey this to you more easily than anything else. She said, Abraham, I've been driving across the Bay Bridges for years and have never felt any discomfort. And this last week, I was driving across one of the bridges, and she said, I felt such panic. I thought I was going to have to stop my car and lay on the floor. She said, I don't know how I ever made it across the bridge. I was terrified. What happened to me? We said, well, you bumped into some thought forms, which she didn't much like the sound of. We said, well, wait a minute. We said, There are thought forms that are all around you. Anyone who's ever thought anything has projected a thought form. In other words, anytime you think, you project your interpretation of some knowing. In other words, it's sort of like coining a phrase. Have you ever said something and to your knowledge you were the first one that ever said it? Jerry, for years, has said, "I would like smashed potatoes, please." And Esther has always laughed until she saw it on the menu last night. And so, as you sometimes coin phrases, you also, whenever you think a thought, in essence, you coin a thought too. And once you project it, it's out there, and others who achieve vibrational harmony with it have access. So we said to this woman, "You've bumped into some thought forms." And she said, "What do you mean?" And we said, "Well, as people drive across these bridges, millions of them are newcomers to the area. It's their first time across the bridge. The bridge feels very precarious to them. Sometimes they've seen the video on television where the earthquake came and the bridge opened up and dumped cars in the water or smashed them from above." And we said, because it's a long bridge, longer than 17 seconds, often these thoughts get projected in a pretty powerful way, and then they coalesce with other thoughts that are vibrationally similar, until in time, as millions of people project thoughts longer than 17 seconds, those thoughts then coalesce with other thoughts until there can be some pretty hefty thought forms abounding. Just meaning thought that's been thought about quite a bit, so it has quite a bit of energy to it. Then what happens, you come along. Now we said to this woman, those thought forms have been there every time you've gone across the bridge, both positive and negative thought forms. Thought forms about how beautiful it is and thought forms about how scary it is. We said, but the question we want to ask you is, what has happened in your experience that is now causing you, for some reason, to be in vibrational harmony with those negative thought forms? She knew right away. She began to laugh. She said, "My neighbor was burglarized last week, and I've been thinking about alarm systems and bars on my windows." We said, there it is. Sounds like two different subjects, a bridge and a burglary, but it is the same subject because the burglary reawakened your feeling of vulnerability. And as you began, now vulnerability, not a sentence, not a word, not really even a thought, a feeling. A feeling of vulnerability was awakened within a projection, a vibrational projection of vulnerability was awakened within this woman. And so when she came into physical or vibrational proximity with others who had had similar vibrations of vulnerability, she got a stronger dose of it than her personal experience seemed to deserve. Get the sense of what we're talking about? That's why we say if you all try to sort this out intellectually, you'll make yourself nutty. There isn't a computer in the world with enough memory bank or sophistication to sort out all of these thought transmissions. That's why we want you to begin to live life on a feeling level.